Hello and welcome to the podcast Wannsee, looking at the international dimension of the Holocaust. This time live from the Josef Wolf Library here at the House of the Wannsee-Konferenz with our guest Grzegorz Rosolicki-Liebe. My name is Jakob Müller.
And my name is Judith Albert. In the next 2 episodes, we will talk about the German occupation in Poland and how the persecution of the Jews took place. Because Poland is one of the most complex cases, we felt the need for 2 episodes. Both will show us different perspectives about that time. Before the Holocaust, Poland was the European country with the largest Jewish community. Roughly 3 million of a total population of 30 million were Jewish. After the German invasion in 1939, Poland became a laboratory not only for the anti-Jewish policy of the Germans, but also for the racial policy of the National Socialist state in general. During the Holocaust, all German extermination camps were located on the territory of occupied Poland. The largest ghettos, Warsaw and Lodz, were established in Poland. Almost half of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust were from Poland, and Poland was also the destination for most of deportations.
When we speak about Poland during the Holocaust, we must be aware of the fact that Poland during the Holocaust was very different from Poland today. Poland's population before the Second World War was very diverse with respect to language and religion. Whereas Poland today has one of the smallest percentages of ethnic minorities in Europe, Poland before the Second World War had large minorities, especially Ukrainians, Belarusians, Germans, and of course Jews. Today, the overwhelming majority in Poland identifies as Roman Catholic. But before the Second World War, there were large minorities of other religions, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and of course Europe's largest Jewish community. Poland's national territory was also very different from its territory today. Large parts of what is today's Belarus and Ukraine were part of the Polish state. On the other hand, large parts of what is today Western Poland were part of Germany before the war. In fact, the Polish borders were shifted westwards after the Second World War. Poland as a nation-state was fairly young when the Second World War began. It was only founded after the First World War in 1919. In the 18th century, the Polish territory had been divided by the Russian, Austrian and Prussian, that was later the German Empire. Only after the First World War in 1919, when all these empires had ceased to exist, a Polish nation-state could be founded. But its borders were far from defined, and especially the relation to the large minority was a constant topic of conflict. So Poland had to deal with many challenges with respect to foreign and interior policy. The most dominant political figure between the First and Second World War was General Józef Piłsudski. He was the hero in the struggle for Polish independence, the father of the fatherland. In May 1926, he staged a military coup, after which Poland became an authoritarian state. Whereas Piłsudski advocated a policy of integration toward the national minorities, more nationalist and chauvinist groups were on the rise. The minority that was the most vulnerable in this constellation were the Jews. They had been the target of anti-Semitic violence for centuries. After the death of Piłsudski in 1935, there were pogroms against Jews. Many Polish universities had even earlier introduced anti-Jewish regulations. The National Democratic Party, or NDESIA, tried to exclude Jews from political and social life. The Camp of National Unity, under Adam Kotz and Edward Ritschmui, that ruled Poland before the Second World War, was outspoken anti-Semitic.
When the Germans invaded in 1939, they almost immediately centralized and introduced anti-Jewish measures that were even more harsh than the ones that already existed in Germany. At the same time, they dismembered the Polish state. The Germans were killing Polish allies and placing Germans in all of the top government function. This is in contrast with the other countries, for instance, Belgium, about we spoke in our last episode. Because of the removal of a central government, the Polish municipalities, and here especially the Polish mayors, became a crucial role as being the highest Polish administrative level under German rule. In this episode, we will speak with Grzegorz Rosolinski-Liebe. He studied culture, studies, and history at the European University, Viadrina. He wrote his dissertation on the life and cult of Bandera at the University of Hamburg and the University of Alberta. Since 2012, he has worked at the Free University of Berlin, where he offers seminars and context research on various aspects of Eastern European and global history. He has published books, essays, edited volumes, and special issues on the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, transnational fascism in Western and Eastern Europe, aspects of Jewish, Polish, and Ukrainian history from the 18th up to the 21st centuries, and anti-Semitism in European universities. Rosolinski-Liebe is a member of the Selma Stern Center for Jewish Studies, Berlin-Brandenburg, Perpetrator Studies Network, and the German Association of Ukrainists. You have just completed your habilitation at the Free University Berlin with a study entitled Polish Mayors and the Administration of the General Government, Holocaust, Occupation and Collaboration, which is yet to be published. We are very happy to have you here in our Josef Wolf Library. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me and the interest in the Polish history and the history of mayors in the Holocaust.
Well, let's start with before the Nazi occupation, before 1939. We gave a huge introduction, but could you maybe give us some characteristics of Polish administration and more or less an idea about Polish society before the occupation? Just a few ideas about that, and then we could get more into it.
Yes, the introduction was so comprehensive that I don't have anything to add. But the question how the administration, the communal administration, behaved during this time in the Second Polish Republic is an important one. Because Jakub has already mentioned the rise of anti-Semitism in the Second Polish Republic and the role of Józef Piłsudski and the National Democracy, which was an anti-Semitic and nationalist movement and a strong party, known also as Endecja. And these are aspects of the Polish history which are known. Less known is how the local administration, the city administrations, the communal administrations acted in the Second Polish Republic. It is the time between 1918 and the beginning of World War II. And it is why I decided to investigate the mayors and look at the Polish administration in the Holocaust. But obviously, to understand how the Polish administration acted during the Holocaust and Second World War, one has to look what was the Polish administration before. To understand the Polish administration, it is actually important to look at the 19th century, because as Jakub mentioned, in the 19th century there was no Polish state. The Poles lived in three empires, in the Russian Empire, in the Prussian Empire, and in the Austrian Empire, and there was no homogeneous Polish administration. There was in the 19th century actually, during the entire 90s, or the long 19th century from until 1918, there were three different administrations in Poland. And they were different in many ways. And there was actually a Polish administration before World War I in Galicia. And in Prussia, very interesting, there existed an administration, but became a very German, almost racist administration in the late 19th, early 20th century. Poles could participate in the administrations, and there were some Poles in the communal administrations, but not many, because of these regulations in the German Empire. something like 80 or 90% of the people in the local administrations were Germans. Interestingly, there were also Jews in the city council in the Prussian Empire. So, for example, in Posen, there were quite many Jews in the city council elected. And then we have the Second Polish Republic, and Piłsudski and other people who ruled Poland tried to combine these three administrations. And they succeed slowly, but it took time. And the administration actually anti-Semitized in a similar way, like the universities and the entire public life in Poland, and very extremely in the last 3 years prior to World War II. So as the Obóz Zjednoczenia Narodowego, the camp, what is the English name of this, the Camp of National Unity, took power in 1937, a part of their policy was actually anti-Semitism, a very strong Polish nationalism. So something only like 2 or 3% of the staff of the local administration is not Polish. Something like 97 or 98% of the people who work in the administration are ethnic Poles. And we have only something like 2 or 1% of the Jews in the administrations. We have more Jews in the city councils, so the Stadträte, because they are elected. But even in the last years, prior to the war, they are excluded. They give up. They gave up. They didn't want to stay in the city councils because of the anti-Semitism. They were excluded also from many groups who were for the administration. So the anti-Semitization of the life in Poland took also place in the local administrations.
Okay, I'm wondering, was there an influence on anti-Semitism in Poland by what happened in Germany? In 1933 in Germany, there comes an anti-Semitic government to power. And did that encourage anti-Semites in Poland to push forward with more radical policies as they did in the last years before the occupation?
Mm-hmm. Yes, what you described certainly happened. On the one hand, Poles were afraid of the Germans, and because of the nationalism, they looked at the Germany as a dangerous state in the West which could attack Poland. But on the other hand, the Nazis were understood by the Polish fascists as very progressive fascists, as people who could be admired, and the Polish fascists could learn something from them, as they learned before from the Italian fascists.
And I'm wondering also, was there organized resistance against anti-Semitism? I mean, for sure, there were Jewish parties who were sitting in the city councils, who were sitting also in the Polish parliament, but were there also attempts of non-Jews in Poland to combat anti-Semitism as a threat to Polish society?
Yes, the resistance to the anti-Semitism, it came from the socialist parties and from the communist parties. So actually similar like in Germany and other countries. And obviously the students, when you look at the universities, we see student groups, Jewish students groups, who learned how to defend. And during the pogroms in 1935, 37, even some Poles are killed by Jews who defended themselves. So that was the reaction of the Jews to defend themselves.
Could you tell us something about the composition of your sample group, so the mayors that you researched in your study?
Yes, I started with 12 mayors and ended with 35 mayors. And at the beginning, I wanted to have mayors from huge cities, metropolis like Warsaw, and then middle-sized cities like Częstochowa, and small cities like Otwock. And very important question were the documents, because you can study a mayor or city administration only if you have the documents from the time of World War II. And this is the case maybe 30% of the cities they have enough documents to study them. So it was very, very important thing. So the size of the city, then the collections, the actual documents that left in the archives. And working in the archives, I discovered new mayors. Because when you go to an archive, for example, in Warsaw, you work not only with the documents of the city of Warsaw, but you have also access to the documents of other cities. And then during this, you discover in new collections, which are important for the study. And it is why the number of the mayors rise from 12 to 35.
Can you tell us something about the work of the mayors and like how much power they had and what kind of scope of action they actually had? And as you already mentioned it, you researched on differences between smaller and bigger places. What was the work of the mayors? How much power did they actually had?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are actually several questions which you ask. So maybe I start with the question of power and what they could do. So the mayors were actually the most important governors of a city, but not in every city. So actually, before the war, the role of the mayors in Poland increased because there was the sanacja regime in Poland from 1926 until 1935, and this regime strengthened the role of the mayors because they centralized the administration. So a mayor rules the city administration. He is the head of a city administration, and in places like Warsaw, city administration had 20,000 employees, so it was a very huge institution. But a mayor is subordinated to people from the state administration. And in Poland, it was before the war the starosta, and during the occupation, it was the Stadthauptmann or the Kreishauptmann, depending on the city. So, for example, the mayor of Warsaw, Julian Kulski, he was subordinated to the Stadthauptmann Ludwig Leist.
But Judith told us in the introduction that the Germans were killing huge groups of the Polish elites. Did they keep all of the mayors, or did they remove some of the mayors? Fell some of the mayors in Poland victim to these first mass killings of the Germans? And did they replace some of the mayors? How was that? How were they installed by the German occupation administration?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so after when World War II started and Germany defeated Poland, so they divided Poland. They incorporated a part of the territories of the Polish state, Western territories, and the idea was to have no Polish administration and no Polish mayors in this part of Poland, and they killed quite many mayors in this part of Poland, and they were trying to remove all the Poles from the administration. They did not work until the end of the war. In some cities, even huge cities like Poznań, even the half of the city administration was Polish, or 30% of the administration was Polish, because they didn't have enough Germans to rule an administration. Very different situation was in the general government, which I studied in my study. They didn't try to replace the Poles in the administration. They kept the city administrations and village administration and all kinds of rural administrations. And at the beginning, it was very different. Sometimes they decided that the mayor who ruled the city before the war should stay. But in most cases, they were hiring new mayors, and it could be the vice mayor who became the mayor. It could be some head of some important official who spoke German, who become mayor. They were looking for people who are loyal and who can they trust. It was not always the case. Very important was the question if this person who become a mayor is capable to rule the city. So they were looking for people who can do this. And maybe, I don't know, I don't have the statistic, but perhaps only in about 20% of the cities, they kept the pre-war mayors, mm-hmm. and in the other 80%, they hired new mayors.
Okay. And What was the role of the mayors now in the first anti-Semitic measures? I mean, the Germans almost immediately centralized anti-Jewish measures. They introduced lots of regulations for the Jewish population. So which role did city councils and mayors play in this first stage of the German persecution of Polish Jews?
Exactly. So they started to introduce anti-Semitic regulations, and they did it very quickly. So when you go to the German Historical Museum in Berlin, you see in the exhibition a huge collection of these anti-Semitic regulations, and it begins in 1933 and ends in 1944. And in general government, it started in 1939, and already at the beginning, they introduced a lot of them because they had already the experience for the German Reich. And it was Hans Frank who was doing this, and he was a lawyer, so he was a capable person who knew who changed the law. And it is interesting because they didn't change the entire law of the Polish state. They kept the law of the Polish state and introduced only some new rules. And it is very interesting for looking at the German officials and Polish officials, how they rule the administrations in the country. They are obliged to use the new German rules, but if they don't find a new German regulation, they have to look at the Polish pre-war law. And it was why the Germans who work in the administration, in the general government, had to learn the Polish pre-war law. It was translated into German and was used. Yes, and very quickly, already at the beginning, the government in Kraków, the general government, the government of the general government was in Kraków, so Warsaw was not the capital of the general government, although it was in the general government. Introduced a lot of anti-Semitic regulations, and the mayors were obliged to introduce them in the communities.
Can you give us an example for one early anti-Jewish regulation?
The earliest regulations were to mark the Jews. So they had to carry this yellow band at the arm. And other early regulations were the obligation to work. It was, I think, the earliest regulation, the obligation to work for the Jews and at the same time for the Poles. So they came already after the proclamation of the general government in October 1939. And then actually every week there were new, each week there were new anti-Semitic regulations in the general government. And they were published in journals, and the journals were sent to the city administration. Actually, everyone who worked in the administration had access to these journals with the new regulation, and the people in the administration were obliged to act according to these regulations.
Big part in the administration were the Jewish councils, so the Judenräte. And could you maybe give us some idea about what were the powers of the Jewish councils, or where the cooperation between the mayors and the Jewish councils, and the differences maybe in between?
Yes, the idea was to split the administrations, to have a Polish administration and a Jewish administration. So a Polish mayor would be responsible for the Polish population, and the Jewish council would be responsible for the Jewish population, which had to live in a ghetto. But this didn't really work, because for the mayors were also responsible for the Jews, and there was a close collaboration between these two institutions. And we see this actually in every city in the general government. So at the beginning, the mayors elect the city councils or are involved in the election of the city council. Sometimes there is a Jewish politicians coming to the mayors, and he's proposing this and these politicians for the Jewish council, and the mayors say, "No, I don't know these people. Maybe you could find someone else who I know from the time before the war." And then during the occupation, they meet very, very frequently. So, for example, Czerniaków I don't know how often he met Kulski, but my impression is very, very often. Actually, every week or every second week, he was meeting
So
Kulski.
Czerniaków was the head of the Jewish Council in Warsaw, and Jan Kulski was the mayor of Warsaw.
Exactly. And the correspondence between this person happened every day because there were a lot of different questions they have to deal. So it's. I mean, for example, one example would be to build the wall for the ghetto. So the Germans decide to have a ghetto, but then they don't know where the ghetto in Warsaw could be. So they have some ideas, but to actually build a ghetto, they are going to Kulski and ask them, could we build a ghetto? Or what do you think about the idea to build a ghetto in Prague, in a part in the outskirts of Warsaw? And he says it is not a good idea because they live some Jews, but not most of the Jews, not so many Jews live there. It is better to have the ghetto in the place where most of the Jews live in Warsaw, and it is Muranów. And there are some discussions, and they consult Kulski, and they decide that the Jewish Council should build the wall of the Warsaw Ghetto. But Czerniaków can build the wall only of the Warsaw Ghetto if Kulski supports him, because he needs all the workers and the materials to build the ghetto. And actually this collaboration between the Stadthauptmann Ludwig Leist, the head of the Jewish Council Adam Czerniaków, and the Polish mayor Julian Kulski, it is something which happens every day. So all the regulations which need to be introduced, they are introduced in the collaboration between these three institutions. And it is important to keep in mind that the Germans keep most of the power and they make the most important decisions. Mm-hmm. Then we have the Poles, which have the position somewhere between the Germans and the Jews. And Jews are the victims on the system. So they have almost no laws, and they are in the process of slowly dying and in the end being deported to Treblinka.
So there is the scope of action of Polish mayor, in this case Jan Kulski, to say, okay, we have to build a ghetto for the Jewish population, but we at least can influence the decision on how and where the ghetto is built, and also about the size of the ghetto, if I understood you correctly.
Yes, this was a very important question, actually, in all cities in town, the size of the ghetto, because the Polish mayors wanted to keep as much of the city or town for the Polish populations and to have a very small ghetto. And this is why so many Jews died in Warsaw and other ghettos, because the size of the ghetto became so small. So at the beginning, the Stadthauptmann Ludwig Leist proposed about 5% of the city space for the ghetto. But then the intervention of Kulski and Polish population, different organizations, mainly economic organizations, they downsized the ghetto to about 2.4%. So it became a very small part of the city, very crowded space, and it is one of the reasons why so many Jews died in the ghetto. So before the deportation to Treblinka in the summer of 1942, about 100,000 Jews died in the Warsaw Ghetto. So the Warsaw Ghetto in Warsaw, in Muranów, which is in the center of Warsaw, is actually a mass grave. So 100,000 Jews died there, and the Polish administrations and the Julian Kulski contributed to this. And it is very interesting process because Julian Kulski himself had Jewish origins. So he came from a Jewish family. The Germans didn't know about this, that he had a grandfather was a Jew, and he didn't feel to belong to the Jewish community. He was a Pole, but he was aware of his Jewish origins. And he was not an anti-Semite, not before the war. He became anti-Semitic during the war as he adjusted to the entire situation, to the expectations of the Germans.
Okay, but wasn't there a feeling of solidarity in the face of a common enemy? I mean, the Germans were hated by the Polish population because Poles were killed, Poles were deported to work in Germany. They were stripped basically of all human rights. So there was a terror against the Polish population as well. Was there not a feeling of solidarity in the face of the common enemy? We have to help each other, and we have to help also the Jewish population that is persecuted by the Germans?
There was some, but not much. For example, when we look at Warsaw, Warsaw defended itself for a long time, or until the end of September, so 3 weeks long, almost 4 weeks long, until it gave up. And during this time, there was a collaboration. There was the interactions between the Poles and the Jews improved. And different than in other cities, no Jewish shops were looted in Warsaw. Jews were not attacked during these 3 weeks. This all happened in other cities, many other cities and towns in the general government, but it didn't happen in Warsaw. There was this feeling of belonging together and fighting against the Germans in September, but it changed very, very, very quickly. So as the Germans came, the Wehrmacht soldiers came, they started to attack the Jews on the streets, you know the pictures. And Poles were looking at this, and they understood very quickly that this is the expectations of the new rulers, and actually they now allow to do what many Poles wanted to do before the war, because the important reason for the Polish anti-Semitism was the convictions that the Jews are an alien part of the Polish nation, and then they hinder the evolution of the Polish nation in an economic and political way. So they for example, quite many Jewish lawyers and many doctors, and the idea was that somehow the Jews are these people who hinder the evolution of the Polish society. And now the Germans are coming, and they are doing this what the Polish anti-Semites, fascists, and a part of the population wanted to do before the war.
So can I sum that up? So you say that Poles in general, or parts of the Polish population, of the nationalistic population, were of course opposed to the German occupation, wanted the Germans out, hated the Germans, but they agreed with the German policy to exclude the Jews from Polish society and took this as an advantage to do that.
Yeah, many welcomed this. Yeah, because there was, for example, rivalization between Polish owners of shops and Jewish owners of shops before the war. And it was one of the reasons for the pogroms in 1935, 1936. But as long as Piłsudski ruled in Poland, Piłsudski was not an anti-Semite. He was actually a person who protected the Jews. And the pogroms in Poland happened only after he died.
Okay.
But the feeling of how we can exclude the Jews from the population, from the economy, maybe we can deport them to Madagascar or to Palestine. This was for all the time from the entire interwar period. And we see after the death of Piłsudski, when the ONZ is taking power in 1937, that all these anti-Semitic regulations are introduced. They become reality. So Poland did become a very anti-Semitic state in the last 2 years before World War II.
But I mean, there is a difference. I mean, to exclude someone from the civil service, to ban Jewish advocates, to ban Jewish students, and then the extreme violence of the Germans. I mean, you said it yourself. They turned basically parts of Warsaw into a mass grave where hundreds, tens of thousands of Jews were starving to death. They were killed by the German occupier and so on. Weren't there a reaction to this crime that happened in the midst of the biggest metropolis of occupied Poland?
There was a very strong resistance, anti-German resistance in the general government. But the important question is here if the resistance was not anti-Semitic, and the answer is no. The resistance was to a huge part anti-Semitic. So it was anti-German, but it was defending the rights of the Poles, but it didn't really support the Jews. So even the Home Army, the AK, it was not the main aim of the AK to help the Jews. They established an organization, Żegota, which protected the Jews and helped to save, I don't know exactly how many, maybe 5, maybe 10,000 Jews. But it was something which was only at the edge of the policy of the AK. And when we look, for example, at Julian Kulski, the mayor of Warsaw, so he was not an anti-Semite before World War II. He came from a Jewish family. He felt as a Pole, but he was not an anti-Semite. And at the beginning of the occupation, when he saw that the Jews are attacked at the streets, he protested against this. Similar to Czerniaków. Czerniaków protested also against this. Why? So there was, for example, a pogrom in Poland, in Warsaw, in March 1940, and he wrote a letter to Leist and asked why the police is not stopping this pogrom, the same way as Czerniaków did. But there was no reaction to this, and actually only during the summer of 1940. So the protest, the pogrom was in the spring, in March 1940, and in the summer of 1940, he started to become anti-Semitic, at least as a mayor. So he adjusted to the new regulation. Many anti-Semitic Poles and Polish organizations were coming to him and asking him if he could exclude this shop or this factory from the ghetto, if he could do this and this. And he, I would say, maybe give up. Maybe he gave up and started to act as a mayor who protects the rights of the Poles. But privately, very interesting, he was and his wife were helping a Jewish family. So they were hiding a Jewish family in their house. They had two houses, one in Warsaw and one in a place close to Warsaw. And thanks to their help, a part of this family survived the war. So as a private person, they were helping Jews, but as a mayor of Warsaw, he was acting as as a person who protects the rights of the Poles at the cost of the Jewish population.
In which year did they start to hide the Jewish family? Do you know that?
This I don't know exactly, because these were quite many persons, and only some of them survived the war. Some of them came from Lviv, so they could perhaps they came to them in 1941 as the Germans attacked Lviv. Some stayed for longer time, some for shorter time. Not of them survived the war because some of them were killed during the Warsaw Uprising. But they were generally open to the idea to help the Jews who need help as a private person.
Because what I'm thinking is, how much did they know? Like when the mass deportation started, did the mayors know about it? Could they know about it, or did they know about the mass killings? And was that maybe the point? Was that the point when they start to hide people, or was that before already?
So they were involved in the Aktion Reinhardt, so the building of the extermination camps and the deportation of the Jews, but they didn't have all of the information, and they were not connected to the people who organized Aktion Reinhardt. They used the mayors, but they didn't provide them with all information. They used them, I would say, as instruments. So they used, for example, the mayors to deport Jews from villages, from small towns to ghettos in cities like Warsaw. Because as the deportation started, they had to be done in a short time, efficiently, and they could do this only if they had already the Jews in the main ghettos. So they were involved in the Aktion Reinhardt, but as the Aktion Reinhardt started in 1942, they knew very quickly what happens with the Jews, because they knew that the trains are going from Lublin to Bełżec, to the extermination camps, and all the Jews are killed. They didn't know the details how they were killed. They were thinking about electricity. Some were thinking about shootings. They didn't know the details, but they knew that the Jews are killed. But it was not difficult to understand that the Jews in General Gouvernement, sooner or later, all of them would be dead, because, as I said, already during 1940, 1941, and early 1942, 100,000 Jews died in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the Warsaw Ghetto was very close to the building of the city administrations. And actually, there was a wall, but the people on the other side of the wall knew that every day 100 or 200 Jews died because of hunger or diseases in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the same happened in many other places in the general government. So this slow process of killing the Jews through starvation, it was known to everyone. And as the deportation started, this is interesting. For example, Władysław Okulus, the mayor of Węgrów, he was an exception because he was a socialist. So he reacted very emotionally to the deportations. He first couldn't believe, and then he started to think how he could save the Jews in his place, if he could help them in some way, but then realized it is not possible. And then, the Jews were deported, and he had to take part in the deportations, but he was not as active as some other mayors during the deportations.
So he was not active. You write about him, about Oculus. He was the mayor in what was the name of the place?
Węgrów. It is a place about 80 kilometers of Warsaw.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a smaller place, right?
It is yes, it is a small place. I don't know exactly how many people live there, perhaps about 8,000. And something like 80% of the population was Jewish. Before the war, maybe not 80, maybe 60. But then during the war, there were deportations to the ghetto from other places, and the number of the Jewish population increased in many cities. It became 80 or 90%.
And you said he was horrified by the violence of the Germans, but he could not prevent that. Polish firemen and police officers assisted the Germans in the deportations. But he wrote down that he was horrified. But there were other examples. There were some mayors who were even actively helping in the deportations, or even inventing their own measures, as the mayor of Otwock. I don't remember the name. What was his name?
Jan Gadomski.
What I wanted to ask is, what was the perspective on the Polish mayors in Poland after the war?
The mayors were not understood as perpetrators after the war, and they were only very few were accused, and there were trials against them. Actually, only one mayor of this group, which I investigated, went into prison for 3 years. It was the mayor of Lublin, and the trial against him happened very early as the Red Army came to Poland. So it was the early process of the Soviet occupation of Poland. It was perhaps the reason why he actually finished in prison and stayed there for 3 years. But other mayors were not, shortly after, a few weeks or months after, they were not understood as perpetrators. And they presented themselves as people who protected the Polish population during the war, what they were actually doing, most of them. And the question, how did they act against the Jewish population, was not asked. And an exception from this are the Volksdeutsche, so the ethnic German mayors. I also investigated some of them. And the courts in Poland, in communist Poland, dealt in a very different way with them. And the reason for this was because they used violence towards the Polish population. So the Polish mayors, they did not use violence against the Polish population. In most cases, they protected the Polish populations. And the ethnic German mayors, they were very hostile to them. Not all of them, but many of them were very hostile to the Polish population. Some killed Poles as they killed Jews. And it was the reasons why the courts dealt with them in a different way as with the Polish mayors.
My question is, would you see the Polish mayors as perpetrators? Because they would describe their actions as a policy of the lesser evil. So the Germans were killing the Jews anyhow. So what could we do? We could try to protect as best as we can the Polish population, and we sacrifice the Jewish population for that, but the Germans will do away with them anyhow. So can you see them as perpetrators in the Holocaust? Because they didn't initiate that. They were just there, and they were trying to defend the interests of the part of the population that they could do something for.
Yeah, I would say they were perpetrators, but it was a specific group of perpetrators. And to understand what kind of what is specific is the question. What could they have? What did they actually do? And it is the role in the administration to understand what is specific about they criminal actions is the questions what they could do during the Holocaust. And to understand this, you have to study the administration and look at the actual actions. And it makes also sense to compare them to the Jewish Council. There were also many trials against the Jewish councils after the war in Israel and also in Poland, because the Jewish population felt after the war that the Jewish council were criminal institutions. They helped the Germans. No, not of this is true, and it was very complex. But in the case of the Polish mayors or Polish policemen, it is different, because the members of the Jewish councils, they were in a different situation than the staff of the Polish administrations and the mayors. And what do we see when we look at the Polish mayors during the war is, among other things, how they became more and more anti-Semitic, and how they acted against the Jews, and how they used the situation of the occupation and World War II to help the Poles at the cost of the Jewish population. So I would call them perpetrators, but I would also emphasize that it was a different kind of perpetrators than the German perpetrators.
Because helping Jews was punishable by death in the general government. To hide a Jew was punishable by death. So people got killed because they were helping Jews. So I think it's very hard to speak of someone as a perpetrator under these circumstances. But okay.
But on the other hand, they weren't asked of the Jews, as I understood you right? So after the war, they weren't asked about how they could help the Jews. They were just asked how they helped the Polish population. So that's a bad thing about what happened after 1945. So
yeah, they use this as their defense, I mean, until today, the mayors in Poland are not understood as perpetrators, and it is. I mean, it didn't happen by chance that the Polish communist courts after the war didn't understand them as perpetrators, because you need time to. You have to look very closely at the documents, to study the documents of the city administration, to understand the specific way in which they become perpetrators and acted as perpetrators. At the first look, it didn't. Maybe most people would say they were not perpetrators because they were obeyed the rules. Maybe the Germans would have killed the Jews anyway, and so on. But when you look closely at the action, you understand they were involved in the annihilation of the Jews.
So we know that you're not afraid of controversial issues after your book about Stepan Bandera. I heard that even some lectures of you had to be cancelled because of bomb threats in Ukraine. And this is also a controversial topic. How controversial is it? I know that the conservative government in Poland wanted to ban even suggesting Polish responsibility for the Holocaust. Would your book fall under this legislation?
I think so, but the government attacks only books that are translated into Polish. And I wrote the book in German, so as long as it's not translated into Polish, I think...
Speak to us in English.
And I am talking to in English, yeah.
Is it just in German or English, or is there any other language except of Polish you want to translate it in?
I would love to translate this, to let this translate, but it is a very long book. It has 1,200 pages. So I don't know if there will be a publisher interested in translating this. Most publishers want to have short books, something like 200-300 pages. And this is a long study. So maybe it will be not translated.
Okay.
But all our German readers can read it anyway then.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for your fascinating explanations about the role of the Polish mayors during the Holocaust and this very complicated and controversial issue. And I wish you the very best with your book and the publication of it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you.